As you know, we have returned to our series, Presidents and Civil Rights. This is part 3 of the 22nd and 24th President, Grover Cleveland. Today, we will talk about how Cleveland felt about the Chinese in the United States. So, Cleveland generally did not embrace nativism or immigration restrictions, but he believed that the purpose of immigration was to attract immigrants who would assimilate into American society. However, the Chinese were under assault. They were under assault in the West. And he did condemn the outrages being committed against the Chinese on the nation's west coast. During Cleveland's first term, there was the anti-Chinese hysteria from 1885 to 1886, which was a period of intense anti-Chinese sentiment and violence in the American West, primarily driven by economic anxieties and racial prejudice, racism. White mobs, sometimes organized by groups like the Knights of Labor, targeted Chinese communities, resulting in expulsions, property damage, displacement of thousands of Chinese residents from various towns and cities, as well as loss of life. Cleveland was appalled by the violence, but he had reached the conclusion that the anti-Chinese prejudice was so deeply entrenched in the West, and the Chinese and American cultures were so different, that the Chinese would never be assimilated. It was the government's duty, therefore, to protect the Chinese resident in the U.S. and to prevent the immigration of more Chinese through a new treaty to be negotiated between the American and Chinese governments. It's not to make the people stop. No, it's to tell the Chinese people not to come here. What kind of foolish thinking is that? How about make the people stop? But I digress. Cleveland lobbied the Congress to pass the Scott Act. The Scott Act prohibited Chinese laborers from entering or re-entering the country, even if they had previously established residency. It was introduced to expand upon the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, and it left an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 Chinese individuals outside the United States at the time of its passage, stranded, with no option to return to their U.S. residence. The Scott Act, also known as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1888, easily passed both houses of Congress, and Cleveland signed it into law in October of 1888. Let's talk about Cleveland and Native Americans. Approximately 250,000 Native Americans lived in the United States when Cleveland took office, a dramatic decline from previous decades. Cleveland viewed Native Americans as wards of the state, saying in his first inaugural address that this guardianship involves, on our part, efforts for the improvement of their condition and enforcement of their rights. Like wayward but promising children in need of a guardian. What? Okay. He sought to assimilate them into white society by means of education, private land ownership, and parental guidance from the federal government. I'm getting irritated now. Cleveland encouraged the idea of cultural assimilation, pushing for the passage of the Dawes Act, which provided for the distribution of Native American lands to individual members of the tribe, rather than having them continue to be held in trust for the tribes by the federal government. It converted traditional systems of land tenure into a government-imposed system of private property by forcing Native Americans to assume a capitalist and proprietary relationship with property that did not previously exist in their culture. Before private property could be dispensed, the government had to determine which Native Americans were eligible for allotments, which propelled an official search for a federal definition of Indianness. The hell? The nominal purpose of the act was to protect the property of the Native Americans, as well as to compel their absorption into the American mainstream. Native American people who were deemed to be mixed blood were granted U.S. citizenship, while others were detribalized. While a conference of Native leaders endorsed the act, in practice, the majority of Native Americans disapproved of it. Between 1881 and 1900, the total land held by Native Americans fell from 155 million acres to 77 million acres. The loss of land ownership and the breakup of traditional leadership of tribes produced potentially negative cultural and social effects that have since prompted some scholars to consider the act as one of the most destructive U.S. policies for Native Americans in history. At the time, Cleveland believed the Dawes Act would lift Native Americans out of poverty and encourage their assimilation into white society. Additionally, Cleveland investigated actions done under an executive order signed by the previous president, Chester Arthur. Arthur had opened 4 million acres of Winnebago and Crow Creek Indian lands in the Dakota Territory to white settlement by executive order. Tens of thousands of settlers gathered at the border of these lands and prepared to take possession of them. Cleveland believed Arthur's order to be a violation of treaties with the tribes and rescinded it.